For those of us who love old vehicles, it's not just the style of the cars or the interiors or the ride comfort that we long for. It's also the sights, sounds, and smells of those classic vehicles and the memories that we have associated with them. One of the strangest memories that I have, but is permanently etched in my brain associated with classic vehicles, is associated with a part that seems so mundane that it's not even worth mentioning. But it definitely is something that if you drove a classic General Motors vehicle from the 1960s to 1980s, you'll remember. And that's the GM washer pump that was used on many General Motors vehicles during that time period. A washer pump, you say? How on earth can a washer pump be memorable? Well, let me tell you how. Nowadays, whenever you hit the wash button on the end of the turn signal stalk, wherever it's located on your vehicle, the spray just simply comes out for the amount of time which you depress the button. And of course, the windshield wipers wipe a few times automatically and then park themselves. But back on General Motors vehicles from the 1960s to 1980s, the washer pump setup was pretty unique and something that wasn't used by the other automakers. More specifically, Ford and Chrysler during this time just had a washer pump where you depress the button, and it was an electronic pump that would then spray washer fluid on the windshield, again, for as long as you depress the button. But the General Motors setup was entirely different than what was offered from Ford and Chrysler, and here's how. The GM system for washing the front glass whenever you depressed the wash button from the inside of the car was not just a setup where depressing that wash button would activate a divorced electronic motor that would suck fluid up from the washer reservoir and pump it through the nozzles located on the hood or in the cowl area. No, the GM setup was a bit different. It actually was a bolt-on setup right to the wiper motor gear that when you depress the wash button, it would activate this four-lobed cam inside of it, and the cam would rotate as the windshield wipers would pass back and forth. And that cam would then make contact with the bottom end of the piston that's shown here sticking out to pump washer fluid from the reservoir through the nozzles. Because this was a four-lobe cam, you'd get an intermittent pulsing spray of washer fluid as opposed to a continuous spray. And it would last for about 2 to 3 seconds automatically before it would shut off and the windshield wipers would stop wiping. Consequently, the wiper-washer action is something that is different and memorable to many people who remember driving these vehicles back then. And this setup did have some advantages as well as disadvantages. One of the advantages of it was that you didn't have to hold your finger on the wiper washer button to keep the wipers wiping or to keep the washer fluid from spraying. Again, once you push the wash button, the washer fluid would be sprayed out for about 2 to 3 seconds at intermittent pulses before it would stop. Most other vehicles from competitors like Ford and Chrysler during this period, when you depressed the washer fluid button, you had to hold it for as long as you needed to clear your windshield. You didn't have to do this on GM cars, though. So that was a nice convenience feature associated with it. But the downside of it were really twofold. The first was that if you really just needed to use a little bit of washer fluid, you couldn't do that. You ended up having to go through a full cycle of 2 to 3 seconds of spray before it would shut off. And back in the day when these cars were roaming the roads, they didn't carry very large washer fluid reservoirs, especially compared to today's vehicles where you can fill, in some cases, over a gallon of washer fluid in the reservoir. The GM cars, the 1960s to 1980s, had about half that capacity, or in some cases, even less. So you'd run out of wash fluid relatively quickly, maybe just a few days if it were especially snowy and there were a lot of salt on the roads and you had to use the wash function relatively frequently. Another downside to the setup was that as opposed to the electric motor setup that Ford and Chrysler employed, which seemed pretty robust and lasted for a long time, the seals in these washer pumps would tend to dry out on the GM vehicles, and you'd have to order a rebuild kit and rebuild the washer fluid pump to restore its functionality. Otherwise, when you depress the wash button, you'd hear some clicking under hood, signifying the cam coming in contact with the piston, but nothing would happen and no washer fluid would squirt out. At least the washer pumps were relatively easy to rebuild, and once rebuilt, the functionality was completely restored. I know it sounds silly to say that one has a memory about the intermittent wiper washing function on these General Motors vehicles, but if you've driven one of them, you'll know what I mean. And another memory that I have of these vehicles that combines with the washer setup is the articulating wipers that were often found on the driver's side of General Motors vehicles during the 70s era on the full-size and intermediate cars that provided a more clear wiping pattern for the windshield than if they had not been articulated. However, this articulating wiper setup was something that Ford and Chrysler also employed during this time period, and Ford employed it for many years subsequent to that on Panther platform vehicles. And one GM division even had articulating wipers on both the driver and passenger side in a butterfly pattern for a number of years, and that was Pontiac in the mid-1960s. It was the only GM division to have that during that time period, and interestingly, it was true for only U.S. Pontiacs. If you purchased a Canadian Pontiac, like a Parisian, they had the standard wiper setup as opposed to the butterfly wiper setup. In any case, hope you enjoyed this video spotlight on what may be a childhood memory for you, as well as myself, and that is the GM wiper washer system on vehicles from the 1960s to the 1980s. We'll close out now with a video showing how this setup worked on a early 1970s Chevrolet pickup. This vehicle has the squirter nozzles mounted in the hood, and you can see with the hood open, they're going to squirt on the windshield in a bit of an elevated spray pattern from normal. But you'll get a sense of why I think that it's so cool, because you just don't have this kind of wiper washer pattern anymore on any new vehicles. Let's take a look. All right, here we go. Notice the intermittent action where it kind of pulses on and off between wiper blade passes. You'll see it again here. There we go. Super cool, just something that I remember from the past and thought you would enjoy. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Also, if you're not yet subscribed, hit the circular icon of the 67 Buick Riviera in the middle of the page. Then hit the bell to ensure that you're notified of all my future videos. Thanks again for watching.